I come from a critical theory perspective that believes in social justice and believes in adult education as a means to begin to attain social justice. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. There are a lot of other areas of adult education that you can engage in, you know, whether it's a traditional classroom teacher or whatever, but the roots of adult education are from a critical theory and social justice perspective. And that's why I'm glad I did my little quiz, because I want to introduce that. I want to make sure you're aware of the roots of where your field comes from. Who else was trained at the Highlander Center for Education and Research? Martin Luther King. The whole civil rights movement emerged out of the Highlander Center for Education and Research, out of popular education efforts. And that's what they do at the Highlander Center. They do popular education and they do participatory research. And they train it and teach it. For those of you who got here late, I gave those who are on time a choice. They asked me to speak for 20 minutes and take questions for about 10. And I offered to do that, or to speak for 5 minutes and take questions for about 25. And much to my surprise, people wanted to hear me talk for 20 minutes. Although we did reserve the right to begin to interrupt me at any time and begin to change that. And frankly, I'm hoping that that you will feel free to begin to raise questions and begin to engage in a dialogue at any point that we go along here, because that's what adult education is. If you listen to Miles Horton and if you listen to Paulo Freire in their dialogues, one of the things that they say, when I said at the beginning, I do political and community development work, community organizing, and I feel very comfortable giving a 20-minute speech in that kind of context. Miles Horton will claim that that's not adult education, that that's community organizing, and that they are two different things. I don't separate them out quite as much as he does, but that's a very valid point to be aware of and to look at. So what are the roles that I've played as an adult educator throughout? Now, by the way, you know, we're supposed to be talking about adult education after OISE. Well, I only graduated in 2006. I came back to OISE very late in my life. So I've been an adult educator going back for a very, very long time. And I've had a lot of experience as an adult educator before I got here. But a lot of my adult education was also intertwined with political and community organizing. I was an elected official in Rochester, New York for 28 years as a Monroe County legislator. I mean, how many are doctoral students? Who's in the master's program? Any doctoral students here yet? Oh, just one, okay. Are you aware that you can do a theoretical dissertation, thesis for your doctorate?
I'm not a theoretical.
Okay. Is Jack still teaching the introduction? Jack Porter still teaching the introduction for the seminar for?
No.
No. Okay. So whoever the new person is teaching that hasn't introduced you to all of your options yet. Jack Porter was teaching the doctoral seminar for introduction for PhD students when I was here. And one of the options that you have at OISE is a theoretical dissertation, theoretical thesis. I keep saying dissertation because I'm from the US, but thesis up here. I was intrigued by that, and I think I was the second student at OISE to do a theoretical dissertation. I did mine on democracy, and I tried to create a framework and a concept of what I believe democracy entails. I used as my conceptual framework Barry Johnson's polarity management concepts. Barry Johnson says that a lot of times there are solutions that we can find for problems that we face, but sometimes there are dilemmas that can't produce a solution. You have to manage them because they're polarities. They consist of two poles, and each of those poles has positives and negatives, and you've got to manage those poles so that you get the most out of the positives and you get rid of the negatives. Well, I liked that framework, and it went with a lot of my own thinking about democracy, and drawing from the literature and drawing from my own experience, I identified 10 elements that I argued are essential for democracy. And I argued that those 10 elements are, and if anybody is interested in this, you can go read my thesis, but that's 350 pages. But you can also email me. I can give you some synopsis of these things, and et cetera. But I felt that democracy has 10 elements that I believe each of which is essential, none of which is sufficient, and that they exist within 5 polarities. And in my doctoral thesis, I went through those 10 elements and how they're related and how those polarities emerge. For me, there's one change from my thesis. I think I got one thing wrong in my thesis, but they're pretty much the same. Freedom, authority, justice and due process, diversity, equality, human rights, communal obligations, and participation, representation. When I did my doctorate, I had participation and regeneration. Regeneration I've now subsumed under both participation and representation. But those are the polarities that I see, and I go through in 350 pages of what are the positives of each and what are the negatives of each, and how do you manage them in a way that you achieve true democracy. I've also been an administrator of adult education programs, and I was executive director of the Genesee Ecumenical Ministries Education Resource Network, where we ran adult education programs on an interracial, intercultural basis for people working with the Rochester City School District in Rochester, New York. I was executive director of the Citizens Alliance to Prevent Drug Abuse, where we did adult education programs for parents who were looking to do things like create alcohol-free graduation nights for high school students, things like that. I was executive director of the Rochester Council on Occupational Safety and Health, where we did participatory research and adult education programs with mostly unionized workers who were trying to change the conditions of their workplace and make their workplaces safer, both from a physical standpoint, but also from an occupational stress standpoint. And currently I serve as executive director of the Community University Partnership Project, which works in both Rochester and Toronto, and I administer getting people together to provide education, adult education, mostly direct classroom for nonprofit and human service workers. But I also serve as executive director of the Seeds of Hope Foundation here in Toronto, where we use a strength-based approach to working with the people at a crossroads in their lives because of mental illness or addictions or financial or medical problems. We operate 2 community centers and 5 residencies where we provide places, and we use a lot of adult education concepts of creativity, of arts-informed programs, of wellness, et cetera. And through those programs, sometimes taught by the people themselves, other times taught by volunteers, people find a sense of self-renewal. So adult education is used in that kind of way. And I said I've been a political community organizer. It goes back to when I was in high school. I've been involved in the civil rights movement, along with my wife Desi, who's here with us today. We've been involved in social justice issues for almost 40 years together. I've sponsored things. I was probably the first politician in Rochester, New York, to champion gay rights back in in the 70s when it wasn't very popular. Just tie a little thing together about popular education and adult education and how it all fits together with community organizing and politics. In 1975, I recruited a young man to the political Democratic Party in Rochester, New York, and he was Tim Maines, a young gay man, and he became very active, and he eventually got elected to city council as the first openly gay elected official in New York State. Went on, he and I was at the county legislature, he was in the council, we were allies on many things. Around what did I do? Tim was elected in 1985. In 1995, 10 years after that, so 75 I recruit him to politics, 85 he's elected to city council. 95, I was the third, I introduced the third piece of living wage legislation in America. I don't know if you're familiar with living wage legislation. It's legislation that tries to have not just a minimum wage, but a living wage. And a lot of communities have passed it. Mine didn't. Monroe County Legislature was a very conservative body. I was always, I couldn't get a second. There were, we're about 50-50 Republicans and Democrats. I couldn't get a second for my motion on creating living wage legislation. That was 1995. But I knew that we could work with city council, and so I, working with the unions and working with a lot of young people, we began getting a coalition together to fight for living wage legislation, and Tim Maines introduced that legislation and got it passed at the city council. So a lot of these concepts are very interrelated and integrated. Well, I think I've gone over my 20 minutes. Yes?
I just wanted to ask your thoughts about, career options for folks who come with an HR background and have taken the MA program.
Well, certainly, adult education, in my opinion, is an essential ingredient in any kind of human relations or nonprofit. Human relations, whether it's nonprofit or in a commercial for-profit business, I think adult education has a key role to play. I come at it from a perspective of that so many of the workplaces that I see are toxic. They are inhumane. How do we make them humane places? That's a social justice issue. It's also an occupational stress issue. And I believe it's adult educators who can best find the ways to do the human resources work that helps the managers to begin to create a non-toxic environment. It's a very difficult challenge, but if you've Marilyn Lakin's course on organizational development traces the history of how we've gone from the scientific management up to the human relations movement. Does she still talk about the ribbon that has gone through throughout the history of adult education and organization development? Organization development, in my opinion, is all about adult education. Unfortunately, I think there are a lot of people in human resources and in management who don't have that understanding of adult education and the organizational development aspects of adult education that are essential, in my opinion, for creating those kinds of environments. So certainly any of the work that you would do in human resources, and Kunle is here, he works in that field, teaches that field, he knows this field. To me, it's all about adult education. And so I think you will be better at doing that kind of work if you are an adult educator.